very much. I'm Dr. Rajib Dasgupta, bit of a typos there, not in your program, of course. I am the chairperson of the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health at JNU and also the managing editor of the Indian Journal of Public Health. I would request this very, very distinguished panel to take a minute for your self-introduction, and then we shall get on to the discussion.
Very good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Santosh Shetty. I'm the Executive Director and CEO at Kokilaben Dhirubhai Ambani Hospital. I'm basically a doctor by training and then specialized in hospital management. And last 23 years, I've been part of running different hospitals across Western India. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Raajiv Singhal. I used to be a surgeon in Indian Army for 14 years. I worked in the Army for 14 years. After that, left. Joined the so-called corporate world. Was in Fortis. Was CEO for Escorts Heart Institute for 5 years. Moved to private equity, and after that, founded Marengo Asia Healthcare. Presently, as Marengo Asia Healthcare, we have 3 hospitals: SIMS Hospital, Ahmedabad, Marengo QRG Hospital in Faridabad, and hospital in Bhuj. That's KKPH Hospital. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. Navneet Bali from Narayana Health. I head the North region for Narayana Health. 4 hospitals in North region. I've served the Indian Navy for 24 years before joining the healthcare. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Akshat Seth, and I head the healthcare business for CK Birla Group. We have a chain of hospitals under the brand name of CK Birla Hospitals. We have a chain of fertility clinics by the name of Birla Fertility and IVF, and we do work in the digital health space. Very happy to be here with all of you today.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am Amol Maheshwari. I represent Fibe. It's a fintech company. Formerly, it was known as Early Salary. We are in the business of personal loans and consumer finance. And I'm very excited about the topic that I'm participating today here with my fellow panelists. And we look at enabling affordable healthcare in the country. We do premium financing on the health insurance side, and we also finance healthcare expenses for patients and caregivers in hospitals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a panel where we have 5 CEOs from very distinguished companies and related sectors. And the theme and the emphasis is on change management and transformational leadership, particularly in the light of the COVID experience. And therefore, what we would do is really draw upon their experience, their lived experience on these themes. And to start with you, Dr. Shetty, in very brief, taking COVID as a very complex and in this complex and uncertain macro environment, how did you really cope with the leadership challenges?
Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. In the previous couple of sessions, we heard the use of the word VUCA, volatile, uncertain, and complex and ambiguous. If there was one condition which truly exemplified that was the COVID pandemic. I mean, truly a black swan event, one hopefully which is a once in a lifetime, and hopefully we've already gone past that once in a lifetime event. So when it hit us, clearly there were a lot of uncertainties because we reacted based on what was the experience in China and Europe and US. You know, you were seeing people dying on the roads, lack of hospital beds. And that is when, when the first few cases started coming in, we had to actually draw from our experiences, from our own infection control specialists, what they were saying, as well as from some of the guidelines that the government was giving out. The one key thing which came out this time was the tremendous collaboration between public and private sector. I mean, we've spoken of PPP many a time, but if this pandemic actually brought out tremendous collaboration. I can at least talk for Mumbai, where the BMC and the hospitals worked very closely together to ensure that bed allocation was done in a transparent way and patients didn't have to run from hospital to hospital in search of beds. One of the biggest challenges that hospitals faced was the uncertainty, the availability of staff, the fear factor. We've dealt with many disasters before. We've had, the bomb blasts, the railway accidents, the floods. But this was one condition where even some of the staff, some of the doctors were initially apprehensive in the first phase. So as management in the initial period to engage with them, to work with them, to give them the confidence that, okay, if anything happens to you or to any of your family members, we are there as hospitals to take care of. And when I say this, I'm sure, I speak also for my colleagues over here. Every hospital really stepped up to ensure that the employees were in a very good headspace, because that was a big challenge to motivate employees who were dealing with a very, very uncertain situation. The second important thing was our partners, our vendors. Some things which we earlier used to take for granted, simple things like gloves and hand wash and antiseptics and disinfectants and oxygen, suddenly became a scarce resource. I have never ever thought in my life that I would actually be sitting and monitoring as to when the oxygen van or the oxygen vehicle is coming to the hospital. This was an instance where some of these things had to actually be taken into a lot of consideration. So when you talk of leadership, when you talk of management, I think important thing was to be adaptable, to keep in tune with the changing guidelines that were happening very, very frequently, to take care of our own employees, to work very closely with our partners, and also to manage both COVID and non-COVID patients. One of the biggest challenges was that when COVID hit, the non-COVID patients started to suffer. The patients with cancer, patients on dialysis, patients who are taking radiation. So as hospitals, we had to balance between both COVID and non-COVID. And that again was a challenge which many hospitals were able to cope up to by following good infection control practices. So we had to live up to the challenge of taking care of COVID patients and also non-COVID patients.
Okay.
Okay. So broadly, these were some of the challenges and some of the things that we had to face.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Singhal, the pandemic has been viewed as in an extreme context and also as a slow disaster because it just didn't go with the first wave. So what were these leadership challenges when we look back of coping with both in an extreme context and as a slow disaster?
Thank you, Dr. Rajib. The biggest challenge, in fact, before I start I would say, because having a JNU professor as setting up question paper is the most difficult thing, because he didn't leak out the paper. So we were trying to actually cajole him and ask him if he can tell us what question he's going to ask, but he did not. So thank you, sir. Having said that, Dr. Shetty spoke about the leadership, and the entire focus is on transformational leadership. Before we talk about any other leaders, I want to say that a lot of people who actually showed the traits of true leaders will never make it to the stage. They are the nurses and the doctors who actually worked in the ICUs during the most difficult times. I think they are the ones who exemplified that for being a leader, you do not need a title. You need to actually perform on the ground to show that you are a leader and you can lead. And those were the most crucial and the critical times where leadership people showcase their leadership qualities without having title. Having said that, that was a disaster which came, nobody had envisaged, nobody had any idea about it. It was like a war thrust upon you. And everybody had a role to play, whether it was a nurse or a doctor or a logistics or as a management. The most important was how all the bodies were integrated. They were fighting for one cause. This is one moment where actually one cause came. It is my patient first, where everyone said, if patient has come to the doorsteps of the hospital, how we all can coordinate our acts and actions together to ensure that patient is safely taken care of. I think that was the most important. And there were certain short-term initiatives. There were certain long-term initiatives. Short terms, the need of the hour at that particular time on that particular day when the patient was in front of you. At same time, the management was actually thinking how if the scale increases, the number of patients, they go up. Do I have a refill? Do I have a backup plan? Can I open up new beds? The supply chain, logistics. So I think this opened a very different array of things where people had to cope up with challenges. And I think it opened up a very different chapter in Indian healthcare where people started understanding the need of coexistence, symbiotic relationship and coexisting with each other. I think that is the biggest learning for all of us.
Thank you. Commander Bali, a leader in such a challenging situation obviously has to be a role model. But my question goes a little beyond. In these kinds of crisis leadership, is being a role model enough, or one leads something more beyond? And therefore, linked to this is, how did power equations really change in this pandemic context, in a very complex organization and network that you had?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think at the outset, when COVID hit us, one thing became very clear, that traditional power pyramidical structure that we see in normal organizations just vanished. It just did not exist. So, truly speaking, the word power itself vanished out of scene, because the moment you talk about power in leadership, it is actually taken, or it is actually seen in a very negative sense. So, first thing that happened in pandemic was that this entire thing about power was thrown out of the door, because if you were to use power to do things, then all the successes that we saw would not have happened. I'm reminded of the French Revolution. I mean, if you heard that great, sentence, that it was the worst of the time, it was the best of the times. We saw the best of humanity, and we also saw the worst of humanity. Why the best of humanity? Because, as my co-panelists spoke about, it was more about collaboration than about leadership, the classical leadership qualities of a pyramid where someone sits on top. And it was not about that, it was more about collaboration. It was also about relearning those qualities which I think we had forgotten, about empathy, about being caring about the other human being. I think those are the things, because we were in a world which was, and again, I would say that it seems COVID did not exist, and I think we are again heading back towards that world. But in that 2.5, 3 years time that we have seen behind us, all those classical power equations, all those classical ways of treating men were almost gone, because we all realized that this was such an event which had no precedence, although we had gone through a lot of pandemics. But I don't think us as a generation, as a human being, had learned those lessons which now would help us. So it was extremely new situation. Secondly, we also realized that time that until unless we kept everyone motivated and kept all our egos to one side, we kept all our, that word which is BOSS or a boss characteristics one side, it's not going to work. So to answer your question, I think leadership went down into the ICUs, the leaderships went down into the emergencies, leaderships went down into small nursing team leaders, leadership went down to the housekeeping staff, leadership went down to the security staff, leadership went down to the every smallest person in a hospital. Leadership went down to the bureaucrats who certainly would wake up, otherwise who wouldn't work, and who wanted now to support this effort. Leadership went down to those small oxygen plants who wanted to, produce one additional cylinder to help this effort. Leadership went down to those organizations which were never ever so efficient. So we saw leaderships change its complete paradigm into going into smaller pockets where almost everyone who was fighting this, because the world was shut down, the only place which was open was a hospital. So every one of those small pockets which we saw the best of humanity. We saw these people rising up to the occasions which was never seen, because they were not many times faced with situations which was life and death every time and every second. And so I would just say that the classical ways that we define leadership entirely went out of the door. It was more of a collaborative, empathetic leadership, servant leadership which came to the fore, and that is what actually helped most of the hospitals, and most of us did very well, survive this phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Seth, you are also CEO of a very large and diverse set of organizations. But through this period of COVID, when there were somewhat different or even competing interests based on on say governmental calls or based on social responsibilities. How do you think you are able to, or as an organization, remain true to your ideals and values, and more importantly, true to your DNA? Was that ever under stress?
Thank you for this. And first and foremost, it's somewhere quite surreal and strange to think back and reflect on those 18, 24 months. I think somewhere it was a period where you almost thought that all the training that we've had all these years, it was meant for this period, and hopefully it's behind us and well behind us. Uh, I think to your question, somewhere I felt both in my role and as an organization, this was actually a period of fairly crystal clear priority, and there was never ever a conflict on, what to do and what not to do. It was a humanitarian crisis. The right thing had to be done for the patients, and every patient at that point counted. I think just providing the right service, making sure they are getting the care they deserve, uh, was the ideal that we worked on, and I think that served us really well. And what came out also was that in a period like this, it was just not enough to treat patients, but to actually heal them. It was not just the patients, but their families that were involved. I think one of my co-panelists talked about the fear factor. It was real. And it was real in the minds of the patient, the families that were attending to them, and also the caregivers on the other side. So I think just working on the medical condition, the emotional stress that the situation brought, the need for empathy, the need for care. Um, I think those were the ideas that really helped us through this time. And honestly, this was a time not to be worried about competing priorities and demands, but have a razor sharp focus on what needs to be done for every single patient who was walking through the doors.
If I may press a point further, it's interesting that you mentioned the word surreal, because
Sorry, the word?
you mentioned the word surreal.
Yes.
And actually, this has come up several times in published papers. The word surreal has been mentioned by leaders who have been interviewed for crisis leadership. Now, how as a CEO, do you remain real within this surreal environment?
I think when we were, and if I reflect back on probably the most difficult day, and this was a day where, and I precisely remember where this thing happened. This was, um, I think about 7:45, 8 a.m. in the morning. And for folks like us, there was no lockdown. The beauty of it is, and I live in Delhi, commute to Gurgaon, we could do that in 25, 30 minutes. There were absolutely no vehicles on the road. So it was 8 a.m. and I got a call from the hospital, and that was the time we were on the last cylinder of oxygen. We were trying to arrange, and then I got a call that we are now sort of last 5 minutes, right? And the sense of helplessness that draws on you at that point in time, but then you are again sort of trying to pull in all possible resources to make sure that doesn't happen. And I think that's where the beauty of it sort of dawned on us. Hospitals around us, the government infrastructure came to the rescue at that moment, and we could sail through that situation. So I think the big focus for us, and I'm sure for each one of us, was maintaining continuity and trying to run as far possible. There was a sense of inevitability that, all of us at some point will get COVID, we will be quarantined, some part of the staff will not be available. But just make sure that continuity is there. And that's where I think what Commander Bali was also talking about, It was less about leadership, but more about teamwork. And distributed leadership is what sort of helped sail us through.
Thank you. Mr. Maheshwari, by the time we come to you, the word empathy has been said at least 4 times, if not 5. A company that finances in distress situations, how did empathy play out during the COVID times, and what would be your experience?
So I think it's a very good question, and before answering that, if you allow me, I'll just share a quick normal statistic which India has been witnessing. So overall in the world today, India spends around 2.5% of its GDP on healthcare, wherein the smaller countries, way smaller than India, on an average they spend 6%, which means that there is slightly a lesser spend expenditure, which is overall from the government side. And most of the patients or caregivers, if you were to see, insurance penetration is around 7%. India is one of a lesser penetrated country on insurance. And overall expenditure which happens in India, around 60 to 70% is funded by the caregiver or patient's pocket, which is India is a very high out-of-pocket expenditure country in the world. Now, these are the normal situations, and as all my fellow panelists were experiencing, situations in COVID, wherein it was completely a black swan event, and there was no rule book written on a situation like COVID. There is a hospital, which means that there is a supply of healthcare. There is a big demand of healthcare, but then supply and demand would only meet up when there is a capacity to pay, and that's where a financer is required. And that's what has been our experience, that during these times, regular times, there is a lot of empathy that you need to show towards a patient or a caregiver who comes to the hospital for a good treatment, somehow doesn't know how much a treatment would cost, exhausts his insurance, but where does he go? 1 out of every 5 Indians who are in distress, not able to afford healthcare, are actually on the brink of selling their houses or assets, jewelry, etc. So that's where one needs to understand the position of these patients or caregiver, and be empathetic about ensuring that a timely help on at least giving them a quick, fast credit comes in. Now, there could be various game changers in the situation. Of course, hospitals have been really instrumental in helping the ecosystem by offering low-cost EMI loans, working with players, financing companies like us, and offering that. So that's actually a big empathetic element which comes into healthcare, wherein I'm a patient, there is a hospital, but what do we do if there's no money to actually pay for the healthcare?
Thank you. We have about roughly 15 minutes to go, so we'll have another round, and I would request everyone to sort of stay within the limit. Dr. Shetty, in the context of COVID, which was a new disease and such an uncertain climate, and I quote a columnist who wrote, it was a mix of known, unknown, misleading half-truths and irresponsible optimism. Given that new knowledge was constantly emerging, how did you really handle that among various categories of healthcare personnel in your hospital?
No, I think the columnist has been very apt and appropriate in terms of how the disease evolved and how the knowledge about the disease evolved. Even now, we are not very sure whether we know everything about COVID. So most important as leaders was, and someone used the word very appropriately, the collective leadership or the reflective leadership aspects, where communication across all stakeholders was extremely important. So whatever information was flowing through the various knowledge channels, whether it is through scientific bodies or whether it was through the local regulatory bodies or the health authorities, it was very important for us to communicate that to all stakeholders. So, this was happening in the form of, say, morning meetings with all department heads, WhatsApp groups, informal modes of communication. The idea was that the last person standing, whether it is the security guard, the housekeeping person, they need to know what is the protocol to be followed, because every day the protocol would keep changing. There was a time when there were no trains running in Bombay, no buses running, so we had to kind of organize for people to move from one place to the other. I mean, things had gotten that bad. So basic communication about these things as well as medical communication across all aspects, whether it is on diagnosis, whether it is on treatment, or whether it is managing them and their families. This was one instance where communication with the family was also very important. I mean, I've had instances where I would have had to speak to the family members of the staff working in COVID just to allay their fears and to put at rest that, okay, it's not as bad as it appears and that there is a cure, people will be taken care of. So continuous communication, empathy, I think was the core focus for us as leaders during this period. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Singhal, as one leader said in an interview, that in the beginning we were having multiple emergency meetings in a day, and then we gradually realized that we don't over-dramatize it. Would you agree with that? I mean, was that your experience? Did we over-dramatize at any point? Not in the wrong sense, but as things unfolded.
I think in hindsight, whenever we look at the history in hindsight, I think we always feel that we are more wiser than at that moment of time. So I think it will be very unfair to comment on saying, because at that particular time it was crisis in hand and people tried to do whatever best. And it varied from organization to organizations. And as Dr. Shetty said, if you have a right communication channel, if you know what exactly needs to be done, I think people carried on with that. But having said that, I said it will be very difficult to say whether who was dramatizing it and who was actually doing the job. On ground, there was a clear distinction. But I think from a healthcare CEO perspective, I would say, I think people who were on the ground, they were far more focused in trying to deliver healthcare to ensure that the meetings have some meaning. There is a communication which can be of help to the patient. And I think the message or whatever has to be carried forward, because every day there was a protocol getting changed. Every day there was some news coming out that this medicine is found better in Western world, something is found better in China, something is happening. So I think it was like multiple information channels opened up at one end. You needed certain meetings to crystallize your thoughts and communicate to the people so that what will be your policy. So I would say, I would restrict my comment on saying that there were very distinct segments on which people on the ground and people actually talking. So I think I would always be with the people who are working on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Commander Bali, a very short question to you. As we look ahead, do you see a willingness to change?
Willingness to change after COVID? I frankly don't think so. If you look at it today, I think most of us don't even remember COVID, or even if we want to remember COVID, I mean, even if you remember those days, we don't want to even think about it. And humanity, I think, has this innate habit of forgetting disasters very, very quickly. There have been world wars, there have been pandemics before, we went through COVID, we as everyone on the stage was talking about, it was emergency situation, it was situation which we did not understand, it was people dying. But I think somehow humanity, I think God has sort of programmed our minds in such a way that we do not somehow have that great 180 degrees change in our attitudes and the way we live. And I think I'm seeing that again once more. It is as if COVID never existed. We are going on consumption patterns exactly even more than how it was before COVID. We are traveling much more than what we traveled during and after or before COVID. Everything is back to how it was, and we just want to forget it. I think maybe it is some evolutionary thing that God has sort of put into our brains. But yes, certain things that I want to talk about quickly, looking at the time. Congratulations to the human race. We are 800 crores now. I think yesterday we crossed that magical figure of 800 crore people on Earth, and it makes us the largest vertebrate species in the world. And out of that, 17.5%, that is around 140 crores, lives in India. We are adding 2.5 lakh humans every day. Out of that, almost half of them are passing away. So we are adding close to around 1.5 lakh humans every day to Earth. So you can imagine. So very importantly, one lesson I think which has gone into all of us, and I think that is something that I've seen, is that never ever will hospitals, the number of hospitals will be enough to treat the, if we fall sick. Never ever we'll have a situation when we'll have adequate number of doctors and nurses. So our outlook towards health has changed dramatically. The last three sessions of Apple when they inaugurated the new Apple Watch, when Tim Cook came on the stage, was all about healthcare. This time it was about temperature, last time it was ECG. So, sorry, last time it was about the SpO2, and before that was about ECG. So everything is now about healthcare. You pick up any newspaper, any magazine, you see that there are talks about healthcare. People are looking at preventive health checks, predictive health checks, genetics, genomics. You're looking at AI predicting, what is going to happen 10 years from now. So I think that has been one of the biggest changes, and I think that is for the better, that we have started looking at healthcare individually. Forget about the GDP, what the government spends, forget about what is happening, across. I think as individuals, we have started looking at the need of health insurance. As individuals, we started looking at our diet, exercise, and in how we should not. And I think as hospital chain, especially I can talk about Narayana Health, we are believing that, patients should not come to hospital at all unless there is a surgery to be performed, or he or she has to undergo a procedure where the machinery is not, we cannot buy it at home. Otherwise, everything should be done at home, whether it is a blood sample test or a test, everything. And one more important thing that I can just say for 30 seconds, I think your mobile phones are going to become very, very important as far as your own health is concerned. Not only they will store your data, but going forward, I have a feeling that everything that you need to be done, your blood testing, your sampling, your ECGs, many of those things will happen through your mobile phones. And that, I think, is a great change that we are, if we have to crystal gaze into the future, that is what has happened. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Seth, two related questions. One, has this crisis given rise to new opportunities? And linked to that, how future ready are we, looking back, and the kind of strengthening that this sector has gone through?
Let me take the second one first. I do think the last 2 years, while it's natural for us, it was a uncomfortable feeling and experience, and we've sort of put it in our peripheral memory. But I do believe there are several deep, innate learning that we have taken, and I think we, for the first time, not just in India, globally, the healthcare delivery system was always geared to attend to an individual's crisis, a single patient, and all the attention that that patient needed, be it in an ICU or in an OT and so on. But healthcare delivery systems and hospitals as one single system and its ability to handle crisis was never tested. And that's why when the crisis hit us, we figured out there were new pressure points. Things like oxygen could be a problem was never under question. So I think on those count and our ability to do some scenario planning, envisage what risks we stand, I think on those counts, I do think we are better placed. The second big learning, I think my co-panelists talked about it. Given the population, and especially if we just focus on the Indian context, what we saw during this pandemic was the huge mismatch in what was demanded and what capacity we had. In India, capacity building in healthcare is the need of the hour, and we are far, far behind than any normal expected levels. And the big learning I feel that has come hopefully in the system is twofold. One, it cannot be done alone by one section of the society. So it's not just private healthcare providers or just government. I think there has to be a more collaborative approach in building capacity in the country for healthcare delivery. And second, on the theme of capacity building is the use of technology, where we don't see delivery only in primary healthcare centers or hospitals, but how do we take it near home or at home? And that's where technology has played a big role. So I feel that's been another big learning where technology adoption was probably at its highest. Interestingly, some of it has come back, but I don't think it's gone back to the level we were pre-COVID, and it will only go up from here. So I think those have been big wins, and we need to build and consolidate it. So while it's okay to forget it, we should not forget the learnings coming out of it.
Thank you. Mr. Maheshwari, the final question and the burning question, how do we make treatment affordable?
So I think a lot of it has happened in the last 5-6 years, wherein healthcare is a segment which has been there in the country for long. But in healthcare, we've been seeing a lot of trends wherein healthcare costs have been going up. More and more insurance is being bought, but still not at such a large extent. So we see that there is a good take-up happening. In terms of the consumers who want to, look at healthcare, these consumers, what do they do today? All of these consumers, we spoke about a product called Apple. Everyone, it's an aspirational product. Everyone wants to buy the latest gizmos. And Apple is one such product which is being actually sold on affordability. So almost, if you were to take a statistic look in the month of March 2022, 80% of iPhones in India were sold on EMIs, which means the consumer today, which is the Gen Z, millennial, aspirational consumers which are growing up, and all of us want to be, looking good. We may not have requisite funds, but everyone gets solace when it comes to that easy kishton mein aap pay kar do, ho jayega. So this consumer class today has been coming up, which has been wanting to upgrade their lifestyle and has been habituating to a concept called, easy payments, low cost payments, zero cost payments. And that's where when a consumer buys 5 things out of 10 on credit or EMIs, his overall behavior keeps on, looking at making himself upgrade time and again. And this is the same consumer when he lands up into a healthcare ecosystem. Now, healthcare is not just only hospitals. It's about wellness. It's about, for example, fertility. It's about skincare and a lot of things. So everyone today is aspirational. Everyone has knowledge about so many offers. Banks are offering it. NBFCs are offering it. And such a customer who comes in to a hospital or a health and wellness ecosystem wants an easy way of affording a treatment. That's where the basic role of a fintech company or an NBFC and a bank comes in. Now, how do we make it more affordable? By basically reducing the cost of funds. If the cost of funds, what does a financial institution do? It borrows money from citizens of India and it lends money. Now, how can we create an ecosystem wherein we can borrow funds at a lower cost? How can we make very simple journeys, role of technology coming in, wherein anyone who comes into a hospital, the first thing, if he looks at the card, he looks at various treatments, he looks at various OPD procedures, he looks at what is the cost. Can I afford it? Do I have the bandwidth around it? He simply could scan a QR code, complete a quick journey. There are enough variables which a consumer has because of the virtue of having an Aadhaar and PAN. There is a lot of information in the entire ecosystem which revolves, wherein instantaneously we can give in a second a particular credit line to an individual. So role of technology coming in at a right ecosystem, which is the healthcare ecosystem, wherein a person can go. He doesn't need to call up anyone, a bank. It could be 2 a.m. in the morning, and he can just look at his eligibility. He can say that this is the affordability that I have. Within 5 minutes today, he can get cash into his bank account and he can afford the treatment. So this is one way of bringing affordability. Second way is, again, how can hospitals, NBFCs, fintech companies tie up together to actually give good offers, good discounts, zero cost EMIs. If people can buy a product like Apple on zero cost EMIs, why can't actually they buy a healthcare treatment? So this is another way wherein a good ecosystem synergy between a healthcare institution and a fintech company or NBFC can promote healthcare, making it more affordable.
Thank you very much. And this has been a very interesting conversation with 5 CEOs. I am not a CEO, but a pleasure talking to you, gentlemen. Thank you. We finish exactly on time. Thank you very much.